In the autumn of 1994, the bell at St. Bridget's never rang, and by noon, 8 nuns were gone. No bodies, no witnesses, just 8 steaming plates, doors locked from the inside, and a single burned ledger line no one could explain. But now, 30 years later, the last person who saw that table still warm remembers something she was never meant to. The initials branded in ash, BV, and 3 words pressed into bone. Penance, service, silence. This is the story of what happened that morning, behind the locked doors of St. Bridget's. If you want to uncover more hidden histories like this, subscribe now. October 9th, 1994. Location: St. Bridget's Convent, Millersfield. The convent stood like a relic on the edge of Millersfield, its red brick walls bruised with moss and time. The locals had long grown used to its silence. The bell tower had not rung with strength in years, yet its outline lingered over the town like an admonition. Most passed it without thought, as if it were simply another ruin of a town too small for strangers, too stubborn for change. On that October morning, the parishioners expected Mass as always. The air carried the bite of early autumn, the trees already stripped in places, their branches grasping like bare fingers toward the gray sky. But the convent doors remained locked. The bell never rang. Hours passed, and only when the groundskeeper, Walter Kane, forced the side door open did the silence inside reveal itself for what it truly was. The first thing he noticed was the warmth of the room. The dining hall smelled of bread and butter, faint and sour, the remnants of a breakfast abandoned too suddenly. 8 plates had been set at the long wooden table. Tea still clung to the rims of mugs. Bread was broken, a knife pressed with a smear of yellow spread into the cloth beneath. Chairs had been pushed back, some angled askew as though their owners had risen at the same moment, summoned by an unspoken command. But there were no footsteps, no voices, no sisters waiting in the hall. Walter searched the dormitories. Beds were made with military precision, rosaries neatly folded atop nightstands, prayer books left open where the last psalms had been read. A lamp glowed faintly on one desk, its bulb buzzing against the silence. The air carried no trace of struggle, no hint of panic. Yet the stillness was unnatural, weighted, as though the walls themselves carried knowledge too heavy to release. By the time police arrived, the evidence had already begun to fade. The steam from the food was gone. The air smelled only of cold bread and faint mildew. Officers walked the halls with clipped voices and weary eyes. They called it unusual, but not alarming. In the first official report, the word chosen was retreat, a spiritual journey, perhaps a sudden calling. The diocese echoed this, speaking of pilgrimage, of higher purposes that mere men could not interrupt. Walter Kane disagreed. He told anyone who would listen that the sisters had not left of their own accord. They didn't walk out, he would say, his voice low and final. They were taken, every one of them. Weeks later, when renovation work turned to the lower halls, a cellar was pried open. The wooden door had been sealed with boards that seemed older than the century. Behind it lay only dust, mold, and a ledger half burned, its pages too fragile to turn. On one fragment, blackened around the edges, a line remained clear enough to read, "Hospitality, 8 guests, $12,000. Notation, BV. The initials meant nothing at the time. The police did not linger on them. The diocese had the fragment locked away, and life in Millersfield returned to its uneasy rhythm, its silence stitched tighter than before. But silence is not the same as peace. Stories spread quietly. Families of the missing sisters spoke in whispers. Parishioners prayed with unease. Children dared each other to run past the convent gates at night. And the phrase that clung hardest, surfacing in half-remembered conversations and hidden letters, was always the same: the Black Veil Pact. Some believed it was a vow, An oath between the sisters, sealed in blood and silence, a promise that if one ever broke faith, all would vanish together. Others said it was a punishment, a ritual penance for sins the convent dared not confess. Still others swore it was not the sisters' choice at all, but the will of something darker, something rooted not in heaven but in the debts men owed behind the church's doors. The town wanted the story buried. Newspapers gave it a paragraph, then turned away. Parish families refused questions, fearful of what answers might reveal. Millersfield continued on, pretending the convent was simply another abandoned building, too haunted by memory to bother with. Yet beneath its stone and timber, something lingered, pressed into the earth itself. It would take decades for that silence to break. In 2019, during restoration work on the northern wing, crews found a sealed tunnel. Within it lay burned blankets, broken rosaries, and index cards with single first names, names that matched the sisters who had vanished. Suddenly the story returned, sharper than ever. Reporters came, families demanded answers. Old files were reopened, and what had once been dismissed as rumor began to look like something deliberate, something orchestrated. The Black Veil Pact was no longer legend. It was evidence. And to uncover it fully, one had to return not just to the night of disappearance, but to the fractures that led to it. The hidden debts of St. Brigid's, the whispers of children who never appeared in any baptism records, and the debts owed to those whose collars concealed more than faith. The truth was always there, buried beneath years of dust and silence. On that October morning, 8 women rose from their breakfast and walked into disappearance. What they carried with them and what they left behind would haunt Millersfield forever. October 9th, 1994. Location: Millersfield Police Department, Millersfield. The police station in Millersfield was a squat 2-story structure that smelled of stale coffee and damp coats. On the morning of October 9th, 1994, its walls were alive with chatter about a missing child from the next town over, about a bar fight near the old mill, about nothing that seemed to matter beyond the edges of the county. The last thing anyone expected was the arrival of Walter Kane, his boots caked with mud, his shirt still damp with morning sweat, his eyes wide in the way of a man who had seen something he wished he hadn't. He walked into the front desk and told the officer on duty, young, distracted, half listening, that the nuns at St. Brigid's were gone. Not late, not absent. Gone. The officer raised an eyebrow, amused, almost dismissive, but Walter did not blink. His voice cracked when he said the word vanished, and though he smelled faintly of tobacco and earth, there was a tremor in him that could not be laughed away. The first call to the convent went unanswered. The second rang hollow. By the third, the sergeant on duty, an older man named Aaron Hale, agreed to send a car. When Hale himself arrived at St. Brigid's less than an hour later, the morning sun had already shifted across the fields. The convent loomed against it, the stained glass windows muted and dark, the cross atop its roof glinting faintly. Hale had been raised Catholic. He had served Mass as a boy in a town not so different from this one. But walking through those doors with Walter at his side, something deep in his chest told him they were not stepping into holy ground. The dining hall still bore the evidence. 8 plates, half-empty mugs, bread broken, butter soft. Hale stood over the table for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze darting from chair to chair. The air was heavy, metallic somehow, like the aftermath of rain on stone. He called out, his voice echoing, "Sister? Sisters?" His words carried down the corridor, bounced off the old brick, returned with no answer. They searched. The dormitories were pristine, beds tucked, rosaries in place, books still marked at their psalms. In one room, a candle had melted down to a pool of wax, snuffed before its wick reached the base. Hale touched the bed frame with the back of his hand. Still faintly warm, as if the sister had left only minutes earlier, and yet the silence was absolute. Walter followed behind, muttering prayers under his breath. His boots dragged, his shoulders hunched. "They were here," he whispered. "They were here just this morning." By afternoon, more officers arrived. Not many. Millersfield did not have the manpower for large-scale searches, but enough to comb the grounds, the garden, the woods surrounding the convent. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the usual paths. No discarded shoes or garments. The gates were shut, locked from the inside. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole. When Hale phoned in his initial report, his voice faltered. 8 women, missing, no sign of struggle, doors intact. On the other end, the dispatcher repeated the word 8, as if to confirm the scale. 8 was not an oversight. 8 was not something you misplace. By dusk, the parish priest arrived, his face pale, his lips pressed into silence. He told Hale that the sisters were likely away on retreat. It happened sometimes. A spiritual journey. A collective act of prayer. But when Hale pressed, when he asked why no one had been informed, why no notes had been left, why breakfast had been abandoned mid-meal, the priest's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "The ways of devotion," he said softly, "are not always for the public to question." Hale was not satisfied. Neither was Walter, who sat on the convent steps long after the officers withdrew, smoking cigarette after cigarette until the carton emptied. He knew the sisters. He had mended their fences, carried their parcels, shoveled their snow. They would not walk away from him without a word. That night, Millersfield slept uneasily. Whispers rose in kitchens and corner stores. Children repeated rumors at school, their stories growing taller with each retelling. 8 nuns gone, they said, taken by angels, taken by devils, taken underground. At the police station, Hale sat at his desk long past midnight. The file open but thin, his notes scattered. He wrote the word voluntary 3 times and then crossed it out each time. His pen hovered over the paper, then finally scrawled, "They left no trace, no reason, no witnesses." 8 vanished. In the silence of that room, with the lamp buzzing overhead and the walls creaking with the night chill, the weight of it pressed down. He had handled murders, thefts, disappearances before. But this was something else. A void, wide and inexplicable, threatening to swallow logic whole. The next morning, the convent bell rang. No one knew who pulled the rope. October 18th, 1994. Location: St. Brigid's Convent, Millersfield. The search had gone cold in less than a week. By October 18th, the convent had grown still again, as though nothing unusual had ever happened there. The police came and went, their boots dragging across stone floors, their questions circling without answers. Reporters had tried, briefly, to stir interest, but Millersfield was too small, too quiet, and too far from the highways to feed a national audience. And so the disappearance of 8 women, 8 lives severed from the town in a single morning, slid toward silence. But silence has a way of yielding cracks. It was a carpenter named Dennis Hobbs who discovered the cellar door. He had been hired by the parish to begin minor renovation work on the convent's lower hall. The building had suffered years of neglect. Its beams bowed, its plaster crumbled in corners. While clearing debris near the northern wall, Dennis struck wood where there should have been stone. At first, he thought it was rot. Then he noticed the lines of iron nails, driven in too tightly, too deliberately. Behind the false panel lay a door sealed with boards, the grain blackened with age. He told Sergeant Aaron Hale that evening, his voice tight with unease. Hale drove out immediately, the tires of his cruiser throwing gravel down the convent's drive. Walter Kane was waiting at the steps, as if summoned by instinct. Together the 3 men pried the door open. The air that rushed out was heavy with mildew, damp earth, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like rust clinging to bone. Flashlights cut through the dark. The cellar revealed little at first. Stone walls dripping with condensation, shelves coated in dust, piles of old hymnals gnawed at by mice. But on the floor lay a half-burned ledger, its spine curled, its pages crisped black at the edges. Hale bent to lift it carefully, brushing ash from its surface. Most of the pages were unreadable. Words dissolved into soot at a touch. But here and there fragments remained, entries written in looping script, dates that reached back decades. One page was nearly intact, marked with a simple heading, Hospitality. Beneath it, Hale read aloud, 8 guests, $12,000. Notation, B. V. The room was silent after the words left his mouth. Dennis cleared his throat, muttering something about donations, about records of charity. But Hale shook his head. The phrasing was wrong. Hospitality, guests, dollars. These were not donations. They were transactions. Walter crouched near the ledger, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. BV, he whispered. Black Veil. The words carried weight. Hale looked up sharply. You've heard that before? Walter nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say it, back when I was a boy. Said the sisters here had a pact, something they kept locked away tighter than their prayers. She called it the Black Veil. The discovery was noted in the official record, but quietly, buried beneath language that downplayed its meaning. The diocese sent a representative 2 days later, a man in a pressed collar and a fixed smile. He requested the ledger for safekeeping, insisting it be preserved by church archivists. Hale resisted at first, his gut telling him it was evidence. But the chain of command bent quickly under the pressure of the diocese, and the ledger was handed over. That night, Hale sat at his kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, staring at his own scribbled copy of the entry. The words burned in his mind. Hospitality, guests, $12,000, BV. He imagined the sisters not as women of faith, but as something else entirely, keepers of a bargain, bound by something darker than devotion. The following days unearthed more unease. Parishioners whispered of odd deliveries to the convent years before, boxes arriving late at night, carried by men no one recognized. A former altar boy recalled a locked room behind the sacristy, one he had been warned never to approach. And Walter told Hale of nights when he had seen lanterns flickering in the fields behind the convent, long after Compline had ended. The story grew in him like a sickness. He dreamed of the sisters, their faces hidden behind veils, their voices chanting in unison words he could not understand. He woke with the echo of it in his ears, a rhythm like a heartbeat under the floorboards. Officially, the case remained a disappearance without cause. No bodies, no evidence of crime, no sign of forced entry. But Hale knew better. He carried the image of that ledger with him, the scrawl of BV pressed into his mind like a brand. And in Millersfield, the rumors took root again. Parents warned children away from the convent grounds. Old women spoke of debts owed, of sins that could not be absolved by prayer. At the diner, at the post office, in the pews of St. Matthew's, the same words were whispered, low and fearful. The Black Veil Pact. No one knew exactly what it meant. Not yet. But Hale could feel the shape of it pressing against him, waiting to be uncovered. And for the first time in his career, he feared that the truth might be far worse than the mystery. November 2nd, 1994. Location, Millersfield, private residence of Ellen Hart. The wind cut through Millersfield that November, bitter and early, rattling windows and shaking the last leaves from the birches. Sergeant Aaron Hale drove slowly through the back roads, his wipers dragging across a windshield streaked with frost. He had received a call that morning from a woman named Ellen Hart, who introduced herself with hesitation, her voice low, as though afraid of being overheard. She claimed to have something to tell him about St. Bridget's, something she had carried for decades. Her house sat at the edge of town, a single-story place with peeling paint and an untended yard. When Hale knocked, the door opened a fraction, a pair of wary eyes peering through. Ellen Hart was frail, wrapped in a shawl despite the heat humming from inside. Her hands trembled as she led him to the living room, where curtains were drawn tight and a single lamp burned with a weak glow. She poured tea but did not drink. Her voice shook as she spoke, her words halting at first, then tumbling faster as though she feared she might lose courage if she paused too long. She had once been a novice at St. Bridget's, she said. In 1954, she had lived within those walls, training for vows she never took. The convent had seemed ordinary at first, strict, disciplined, but ordinary. Yet she began to notice things: midnight gatherings in the chapel, the sound of chanting that was not part of the liturgy, visitors who arrived under cover of darkness, men who never attended Mass but were welcomed into hidden rooms, and always the sisters whispering of the pact. Ellen never learned the details, only fragments. But she remembered the ledger. It was kept locked in the Mother Superior's study, a record not of donations but of transactions. Guests, she said, were always written in groups, sometimes 6, sometimes 8. Never fewer. Money changed hands, though she never saw the exchange, and afterward, the guests were never seen again. Her voice broke then, her gaze falling to the floor. She had asked questions once. Too many. The Mother Superior's smile had hardened, her words sharp. Faith is obedience, she had told Ellen. Doubt is abandonment. That night Ellen had packed her belongings and fled, never looking back. Hale listened, his pen unmoving, his stomach tightening with each detail. Ellen was not seeking attention. She seemed almost ashamed, as though confessing a sin. Her eyes searched his, pleading for belief. "They're gone," she whispered. "But this isn't new." "It's been happening for years. Decades." He left the house with her words echoing inside him. Driving back through the frozen fields, he thought of the ledger, of Walter's trembling whisper of the black veil. He thought of Ellen's thin hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes wet with memory. It was not evidence, not in any court, but it was testimony. And testimony carried its own weight. That evening, Hale sat across from Walter in the back booth of the diner. The place was half empty, the waitress topping their cups with burnt coffee. Hale told him what Ellen had said, every word, every detail. Walter stared down at his plate, pushing eggs around with his fork. When Hale finished, Walter nodded slowly. "My grandmother wasn't wrong," he muttered. "The black veil wasn't just a story. It was a promise." Hale asked what he meant, but Walter only shook his head. "A promise kept in silence, a promise paid in flesh." The words made Hale's skin crawl. 2 days later, Ellen Hart was found unconscious on her kitchen floor. A stroke, the doctors said. She lingered in the hospital, silent, her eyes half open but vacant. She never spoke again. Hale visited once, standing at her bedside, watching her frail chest rise and fall. He wondered if she had been silenced by her own body or by something older, something darker that did not forgive betrayal. On the drive home, the sky split open with snow, heavy and relentless. The town vanished behind a curtain of white, and for the first time, Hale felt the full weight of the mystery pressing in, suffocating. This was no longer a case. It was a reckoning. November 12th, 1994. Location: St. Matthew's Parish Rectory, Millersfield. The rectory was warm with the smell of candle wax and old paper when Sergeant Hale knocked on its heavy oak door. Father Paul Marrow answered, his cassock slightly rumpled, his expression drawn in a way that suggested both age and burden. Hale had known the priest for years. Every funeral, every wedding, every christening had passed beneath his care. He was steady, familiar, a fixture of the town. Yet Hale's gut told him something lay behind that weary face, something tethered to St. Brigid's. Father Paul invited him in, ushering him through a narrow hallway lined with crucifixes. The living room was dim, curtains drawn, books stacked high on every surface. Hale noticed the tremor in the priest's hand as he poured 2 glasses of brandy. "You're here about the convent," Father Paul said before Hale could speak. His voice was soft but edged with resignation. "I wondered how long it would take." Hale sat forward. "You know something, Father. Ellen Hart told me enough to suspect this isn't just a disappearance. This has been going on a long time." The priest's eyes flickered at the name. He lowered himself into a chair, clutching his glass. "Ellen should have forgotten. The Lord gives us the strength to put away the shadows. She chose not to." "Put away?" Hale pressed. "Or cover up?" Father Paul stared at him for a long time, then leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "There are things the church has survived by burying. St. Brigid's was one of them." He told Hale that decades earlier, before his ordination, the convent had been whispered about even among clergy. It was considered both an embarrassment and a necessity. An embarrassment because of its strange practices, its unorthodox autonomy, but a necessity because it had powerful benefactors. Families with wealth, with secrets, families that sought to erase inconvenient truths. The sisters provided a service. Quiet, final, without question. The church called it charity, Father Paul said. But it wasn't charity. It was a bargain. Hale's throat tightened. "Guests," he said, "like in the ledger." The priest nodded grimly. "People who needed to disappear. Husbands who shamed their families. Daughters who bore children out of wedlock. Rivals who stood in the way of inheritances. They were sent to St. Brigid's. And after that, they were gone. Their families donated generously, of course, enough to keep the convent alive, enough to keep questions at bay. The words chilled Hale more than any winter wind could. He had thought of the sisters as victims or as perpetrators, but this was machinery. Cold, transactional, woven into the town's very history. "Where are they now?" Hale asked. "The bodies?" Father Paul closed his eyes, as though against some private torment. "I never saw. I never asked. The less one knew, the safer it was." Hale rose to his feet, pacing the small room. "You're telling me 8 women are missing right now because of a system you knew about, a system you let continue." The priest's voice cracked. "I had no power to stop it. The convent answered to higher authority than me. I begged the bishop once, long ago. He told me to tend to my flock and leave the sisters to their vows." Hale's anger boiled, but beneath it was a cold certainty. Father Paul was not lying. His shame was too raw, too naked. He was a man who had lived with knowledge too heavy to confess, too dangerous to expose. Before Hale left, the priest handed him something, a small iron key, tarnished with age. "This was given to me years ago by Sister Agnes," he whispered. "She was frightened. She said it unlocked something hidden in the convent cellars. She begged me to take it, to keep it safe. But I never used it. I couldn't." Hale turned the key over in his palm. It was heavy, crude, its teeth oddly shaped. He felt the weight of it as though it were an anchor to the truth he had been chasing. As he drove away from the rectory, the snow had begun again, flakes tumbling through the air like ash. The key lay on the passenger seat beside him, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Hale's chest tightened with the knowledge that he now held more than a clue. He held an invitation. Behind him, in the rectory window, Father Paul stood motionless, a shadow against the curtain. He did not wave, He only watched, as though he knew the path Hale had chosen would lead him into darkness from which there was no return. November the 18th, 1994. Location: St. Brigid's Convent, Millersfield. The convent loomed in the half-light of early evening, its windows dark, its walls streaked with rain that had frozen into brittle sheets of ice. Hale parked his car at the end of the gravel drive, the sound of crunching stones loud in the silence. The iron key weighed heavily in his coat pocket, its edges biting against his palm each time his hand brushed it. Inside, the hall smelled of mildew and dust. His flashlight beam cut across peeling plaster, cracked tile, and crosses that hung at uneven angles. Hale's boots echoed as he moved deeper, past the abandoned dormitories, past the cloister where silence seemed to thicken like fog. He descended to the lower level, the air turning damp and sour. The keyhole revealed itself at the base of a heavy oak door in the cellar corridor, nearly hidden by a rotting tapestry that crumbled when he brushed it aside. Hale pulled out the key, hesitating only a moment before sliding it into the lock. It turned with a grinding protest, the sound reverberating through stone like a warning. The door opened into a narrow stairwell spiraling downwards, carved directly into the earth. The air smelled of soil and rust, of something old and undisturbed. His light revealed rough walls etched with faint markings, Latin prayers scrawled in faded paint. He descended slowly, each step creaking under his weight. At the bottom lay a chamber, low, cramped, its ceiling arched like a crypt. The walls were lined with alcoves, each sealed with slabs of stone. Hale stepped closer, his breath frosting in the stale air. The slabs bore names, not of saints, but of ordinary men and women. Names he recognized from old town records, names whispered in missing persons reports long buried in archives. The ledger was real. The stories were true. One alcove stood open, its slab cracked and fallen to the floor. Inside lay a tangle of bone, collapsed and brittle, scraps of fabric still clinging. Hale's flashlight trembled in his hand. It wasn't one body. It was three. Their skulls tilted at unnatural angles, jaws open as though frozen mid-scream. His knees weakened, bile rising in his throat. He staggered back, pressing himself against the damp wall, his mind racing. This was not just burial. This was entombment, systematic and deliberate. The sisters had made a cemetery beneath their feet, a ledger carved into stone. At the far end of the chamber, something caught his eye. A wooden chest, half-rotted, its lid chained and padlocked. Hale approached, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The lock was ancient, corroded but intact. He slid the iron key into it, and with a sharp twist, it snapped open. The chest groaned as he lifted the lid. Inside, bundled in waxed cloth, were journals, dozens of them, bound in leather, their pages inked in precise, looping script. Hale pulled one free and opened it under his beam. The writing detailed dates, names, payments. Each entry followed the same grim cadence: a guest received, a service rendered, a donation received. The last word of every entry was the same: fulfilled. He flipped through, his stomach churning. The names matched the alcoves. Some were decades old, others alarmingly recent. One date chilled him more than the rest. October 1994, just weeks earlier. The entry noted 8 guests. The line beneath it read only, fulfilled. Hale dropped the book back into the chest, his hands trembling. The missing sisters were not victims. They were participants. Whether they had vanished or been vanished themselves remained unclear, but their complicity was carved into these records. He closed the chest, the sound echoing like a coffin lid. In that underground silence, with bones at his back and the journals at his feet, he realized he had stumbled upon more than evidence. He had found the true heart of the Black Veil Pact, a secret so meticulously hidden, so dangerously preserved, that exposing it could fracture the town, the church, perhaps even himself. When Hale finally ascended, his legs shook. He sealed the door behind him, slipping the key back into his pocket as though hiding the truth from the world above. But the weight of what he carried was no longer metal. It was history, blood-soaked and damning, pressing down on him with every step toward daylight. November 21st, 1994. Location, Millersfield. Nursing home, room 213. The nursing home smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers, the kind of place where life seemed to wait quietly for its end. Sergeant Hale had come here reluctantly, his chest still tight from the discoveries beneath the convent. He wasn't sure what answers he expected, but the journals had pointed him here. Among the names, one kept reappearing, Sister Agnes, and according to town records, she hadn't disappeared like the others. She had been quietly transferred decades ago, later resurfacing in Millersfield under another identity. Now she was 91 years old, confined to a wheelchair, her mind said to be faltering. Hale stepped into her room. The curtains were half drawn, letting in weak sunlight that fell across the frail figure in the chair. Her skin was paper-thin, her eyes milky but startlingly alert as they found him. On her lap lay a rosary, its beads worn smooth from years of use. "You've come too late," she whispered, before he had spoken a word. Hale froze. "Sister Agnes." Her lips curved into something like a smile, though it held no warmth. "That's a name I haven't heard in 50 years. He pulled a chair closer, lowering his voice. "I know about the convent. I've seen what's below, the alcoves, the journals. I know what you did." Her hand tightened around the rosary. "What we did," she corrected softly. "Don't pretend Millersfield's hands are clean. The sisters didn't act alone. The town asked, and we answered. We were the blade they turned away from themselves." Her words sent a chill through him. "Why? How could you justify it?" Sister Agnes's gaze drifted to the window, her voice low, almost confessional. "We were told it was mercy, that the people brought to us were lost, disgraced, dangerous, that their removal preserved families, preserved reputations. The church called it service. The townsfolk called it protection. But after the first year, I stopped asking who they were. I stopped asking why. We all did. It was easier to believe it was God's will." Her breath rattled, and Hale leaned closer. "And the sisters who vanished? Ellen Hart says they didn't all leave by choice." Sister Agnes's fingers stilled on the rosary beads. A long silence followed, punctuated only by the hiss of the radiator. "Some doubted, some wanted out. They thought they could speak. But once you've taken the veil in that place, once you've served the pact, you can't unbind yourself. The others made sure of that. A pact doesn't end. It consumes." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment, Hale saw something raw flicker across her face. Terror, old and unhealed. He pressed. "Where are the 8 who disappeared this year?" Her eyes sharpened with sudden clarity. "Gone where all the others went. You think their bones rest only below the convent? Number the earth is wide, Sergeant. The rivers carry secrets. Fires consume them. Not everything can be found in ledgers." Her hand trembled as she reached for his wrist. "Listen to me. The pact wasn't just St. Bridget's. It lives in Millersfield still. In families. In names you know. They won't let you drag it into the light. They can't." Hale swallowed, his pulse quickening. "Who? Tell me." Her grip tightened, impossibly strong for her frailty. "You already know. Look into your own records. Look at who funded the convent year after year. Look at the donations, the charities. The black veil isn't buried. It's breathing." Her voice cracked, collapsing into a whisper. "And I am damned for it." Moments later, her strength ebbed, her hand slipping from his. The nurse rushed in as Sister Agnes's breathing faltered, but Hale knew. Her confession had been her last offering. Within minutes, she was gone, her rosary falling to the floor with a dull clatter. Hale picked it up, turning the beads in his hand. Each was smooth, polished not only by prayer but by guilt. He tucked it into his pocket as the staff hurried around him, his mind spiraling. The journals had shown him the structure of the pact. The alcoves had shown him the scale. And now Sister Agnes had given him something far worse. The certainty that it was not history. It was present. It was alive. As he stepped out of the nursing home into the brittle November air, Hale felt the weight of the rosary in his coat. Not a symbol of faith, but a reminder. A dying woman's confession that the darkest secret of Millersfield had not ended with the convent. It had only changed its shape. November 25th, 1994. Location: Millersfield Town Hall, Archives Room. The Archives Room in Millersfield's Town Hall was a place few visited willingly. Its ceiling sagged under water stains, and the smell of old paper clung to the air like dust itself. Hale stood at the threshold, hands deep in his coat pockets, staring at rows upon rows of shelves lined with bound ledgers, tax rolls, and donation logs. This was where Sister Agnes had pointed him, where the living threads of the Black Veil Pact still lay woven, if one knew where to look. The clerk had been reluctant, but yielded to his badge, leading him to a table in the center of the room. Boxes of unsorted records were stacked on one side. "These are what you want," the clerk muttered, before retreating. Hale was left in silence, the fluorescent light flickering above him like a nervous tick. He opened the first box. Receipts, donations, handwritten notes scrawled in cursive that seemed foreign in the age of typewriters. At first it looked mundane: parish funds, community drives, anonymous contributions for church upkeep. But as he flipped through, patterns began to emerge. The name St. Bridget's Convent repeated itself across decades. Large donations, often in cash, sometimes disguised as charitable grants. The same surnames surfaced again and again: Whitmore, Keller, Driscoll, O'Hara. Families old as Millersfield itself, names etched into street signs and law offices, their influence stretching across generations. Hale's pen scratched notes furiously in his notebook. The convent had not been isolated. It had been sustained, not just by the church, but by the town's elite. He pulled another ledger, dated 1953. His finger traced across columns of donations until one line caught him. Private contribution, $1,200, recorded under town account by request. The note in the margin bore a name: J. Whitmore. Hale's stomach turned. The Whitmores weren't just benefactors. They were patrons. The deeper he went, the darker the pattern grew. In 1961, the year several townsfolk had vanished during a mill strike, an influx of special donations flowed directly to the convent. In 1974, a year remembered for an unsolved rash of disappearances along the river, the ledgers recorded emergency contributions for cloister repairs. The numbers swelled every time the town's whispers darkened. It was all there, written in ink no one had bothered to conceal. As Hale turned a brittle page, another note caught his eye. A payment dated 1980, for confidential services rendered. The sum, $5,000. The donor, C. Driscoll. In the same year, 3 names appeared on missing persons lists. None ever found. His throat tightened. This wasn't negligence. It was collusion. From the shadows of the archive shelves, the faint hum of the building's old boiler reverberated. But Hale felt as though the silence around him had thickened, as though the walls themselves had taken notice. His hand shook slightly as he traced another entry. More recent, 1991. A payment marked Anonymous Donation, $10,000. But in the margin, faintly penciled in as though later erased, was a name: E. O'Hara. He sat back, his chair creaking. The O'Haras were pillars of the community, celebrated for their philanthropy, their generational wealth. To find their name here was no coincidence. Sister Agnes had been right. The pact had never died. It had been maintained, disguised beneath the guise of civic charity and religious devotion. Hale rubbed his eyes, exhausted, but pressed on. At the bottom of one box, folded among routine papers, was a letter. He flattened it against the table, his breath catching as he read. To the Sisters of St. Bridget, we entrust the matter to you, as discussed. This contribution should suffice to ensure the service is fulfilled. May our town remain in grace. The signature was faded but clear. John Whitmore. The letter wasn't dated, but Hale knew its weight. He had just found direct evidence of conspiracy. Not just donations, but instructions, acknowledgement of what the convent truly provided. His pulse quickened as he slipped the letter into a folder, then carefully packed away the ledgers. His notebook was heavy with names, dates, numbers, threads that tied Millersfield's most respected families to the darkest work the convent had done. As Hale left the archives, stepping into the cold November night, he felt eyes on him. A figure lingered across the street, half swallowed in shadow. When Hale's gaze met it, the figure turned and walked away without hurry, disappearing into the dark. He tightened his grip on the folder under his arm. He wasn't alone in these discoveries anymore. Someone was watching, someone who knew what he was digging up. Sister Agnes's words echoed in his mind. They won't let you drag it into the light. And for the first time, Hale wondered if the real danger wasn't buried beneath the convent, but walking freely in the streets of Millersfield. November 28th, 1994. Location: Whitmore Estate, Millersfield outskirts. The Whitmore Estate rose out of the barren fields like a fortress from another age. Its stone walls caught the last glint of late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the iron gates. Sergeant Hale parked at the edge of the drive, his headlights sweeping across the manicured lawns and the cold marble statues lining the path. To anyone else, it might have looked like wealth preserved, heritage maintained. To Hale, after what he had read in the archives, it looked like the seat of an old and dangerous power. The front door opened before he knocked. A man in his 50s stood framed by the light of the chandelier behind him. Crisp suit, perfect posture, his silver hair swept neatly back. John Whitmore, the third of his name. His gaze was calm but not welcoming. "Sergeant Hale, we've heard you've been digging where few care to dig anymore." His voice was smooth, rehearsed, carrying no question. Hale kept his tone steady. "I need to ask you about the convent, about your family's involvement." Whitmore's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind reserved for those already dismissed. "The convent was a charitable institution. My family supported it, as did many others. I trust the town archives told you as much." Hale held out the folder. Inside was the letter. "We entrust the matter to you, as discussed. Charity doesn't usually involve instructions like these. Your grandfather didn't just support the convent, he directed it." For the first time, Whitmore's composure wavered. His eyes flicked briefly to the paper, then back to Hale. "You should be careful about the weight you give to old scraps of paper. Context can be misleading." 3 missing persons in 1980, Hale pressed. "Your family donated $5,000 that year. In 1961, during the mill strike, another wave of disappearances, another surge of contributions. It's all tied together." Whitmore stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior. "If you're going to make such accusations, at least come in from the cold. Let us talk like men, not like adversaries." The estate's interior was suffocatingly grand. Oil portraits of Whitmore ancestors lined the hallways, their gazes heavy with silent judgment. Hale followed John into a study where the fire crackled, bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, and a crystal decanter gleamed on the table. Whitmore poured himself a drink. "Do you know what Millersfield was like in the 1920s, Sergeant? It was a town of filth. Men drinking themselves to ruin, women cast out in shame, children left starving. The convent offered order. discipline. A place where broken lives could vanish without scandal. Do you call that cruelty or mercy? Hale's jaw tightened. It was murder. Whatever excuse you wrap it in, people disappeared. Whitmore sipped slowly, savoring the whiskey. People disappear every day. Some leave willingly. Some are guided. And the town prospers because of it. Millersfield has always been clean, always untouched by the kinds of scandals that rot other towns. That is not an accident, Sergeant. That is stewardship. Hale leaned forward, his voice sharp. You're admitting it. You're saying your family sanctioned the pact. Whitmore chuckled, low and humorless. You hear what you want to hear. What I'm telling you is that the pact was not a crime. It was a covenant. The convent served the town. And when the sisters faltered, when some tried to walk away, others ensured the covenant endured. We all did our part. The fire popped, throwing sparks against the grate. Hale stared into Whitmore's eyes, searching for any trace of shame. There was none. Only conviction. You're still funding it, Hale said finally. Sister Agnes told me it hasn't ended. It's alive. Whitmore's smile returned, faint but chilling. Alive? Sergeant, it's woven into this town's very bones. Look around you. The schools, the libraries, the charities, all touched by families who understood the necessity of sacrifice. Even now, Millersfield remains free of the filth you'll find in other towns. Do you really think that's luck? Hale rose from his chair. It's corruption. And it's going to end. Whitmore set his glass down with a deliberate clink. Be very careful, Sergeant. You're poking at roots older than you can imagine. Some secrets keep towns alive. Expose them, and you may kill what you're so desperate to save. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whisper of the fire. Hale turned and left without another word, the weight of Whitmore's warning pressing against his chest like a stone. Outside, the night had fallen fully. The estate loomed behind him, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. As he walked back to his car, Hale felt that same sensation as before. Someone watching, unseen, waiting. He gripped the folder tighter, though deep down he wondered whether his evidence was protection enough. Whitmore's words echoed in his mind as he drove away. Some secrets keep towns alive. Hale didn't yet know if exposing the Black Veil Pact would free Millersfield or destroy it. December 2nd, 1994. Location, Millersfield, East Hollow Road. Snow had begun to fall over Millersfield, softening the edges of its streets, muting the sounds of the town. But beneath the fragile beauty of the first winter storm, Sergeant Hale's nerves were sharp, restless. He had been set to meet with someone, a woman who had called his office the night before, her voice cracking with hesitation, yet heavy with urgency. Her name was Margaret Donnelly, a retired nurse who had lived in Millersfield all her life. She had been present at St. Bridget's during the 70s, tending to the sisters when sickness swept through the convent. On the phone she had whispered, "I saw things I was told to forget, but I can't anymore. They kept records. They kept trophies." She had insisted on meeting in her home at the edge of town, off East Hollow Road. Hale had agreed, telling himself it was finally a breakthrough, a living witness, someone who could confirm what the Ledgers and Whitmore's arrogance only suggested. The drive took him past snow-laden fields, the branches bending under white weight. The Donnelly house was small, a faded yellow farmhouse tucked behind a stone wall. But when Hale pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. No light in the windows, no smoke curling from the chimney. He knocked once, then again. Silence. He circled the house, boots crunching on snow, and spotted the back door ajar. His hand went to his sidearm instinctively. Inside, the air was stale and cold. A half-drunk cup of tea sat on the kitchen table, the steam long gone. A wool blanket lay crumpled on the floor near an armchair, as though dropped mid-use. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, the only sound in the house. "Margaret?" His voice cut through the stillness, met only by echoes. Hale moved carefully through each room. Nothing broken, no signs of forced entry. But Margaret Donnelly was gone. He found her purse on the counter, wallet inside. Her coat hung neatly by the door. It wasn't the scene of someone who had left willingly. In the bedroom, Hale froze. On the dresser lay a folded piece of paper, weighed down by a rosary. He unfolded it, his pulse pounding. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "I was wrong to speak. The pact never ended. Forgive me." M.D. Hale stared at the note, bile rising in his throat. It reeked of coercion, of someone forcing her hand. But if Margaret had been taken or silenced, he was too late to stop it. The sound of a car engine rumbled faintly in the distance. Hale went to the window, peering out into the falling snow. Headlights faded down East Hollow Road, the vehicle already vanishing into the white curtain. His gut told him it wasn't random. He called in a report, but his words felt hollow as he relayed them. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol, but Hale knew by the time they searched there would be no trace. Whoever had been here had worked with precision. Back in the kitchen, he sat heavily at the table, staring at the abandoned cup of tea. Margaret had been ready to talk. She had been ready to hand him the thread that might have unraveled the entire web. And now, she was gone, like so many before her. He thought of Whitmore's warning. Some secrets keep towns alive. Had Margaret become another offering to that secret? Another disappearance added to the silent list the town carried like a hidden ledger. Hale clenched his fists. He had to believe she was alive. Somewhere. That the pact hadn't erased her completely. But in Millersfield, belief was fragile. Hope was dangerous. As he stepped back into the snow, his eyes swept the road. He knew someone had been watching him, trailing his steps, and now, whoever they were, they had taken the one witness who might have given him the truth. The snow fell harder, covering footprints, erasing the faintest signs of struggle. By morning, there would be nothing left to prove Margaret Donnelly had ever been there at all. December 10th, 1994. Location: St. Brigid's Convent grounds, Millersfield. The convent stood in silence, its windows dark, its doors barred against the creeping winter night. Hale pulled up the collar of his coat as he stepped out of the car, the December wind cutting sharp against his skin. The building loomed, skeletal in the snow, its roof sagging under years of neglect. He had come alone, flashlight in hand, following a lead buried in the town archives. Blueprints from the 1920s showing structures beneath the convent that were never mentioned in public records. Root cellars, tunnels, sublevels, places no one spoke of. The lock on the side door was old, rusted, and it gave easily under the pry of his crowbar. Inside, dust swirled with his breath, stirred by the crunch of his boots. The air smelled of damp wood and mold. His flashlight beam cut across broken pews and collapsed plaster. Every instinct screamed caution, yet something stronger pulled him onward. The need for proof. Something tangible that no Whitmore, no priest, no carefully crafted denial could erase. He found the stairwell at the far end of the hall. The steps descended steeply, stone walls closing in as he went lower. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the ground itself was resisting intrusion. At the bottom was a locked iron gate. He shoved hard, and the hinges groaned, the sound echoing down unseen corridors. Beyond lay a tunnel, narrow, carved roughly into the earth. His flashlight swept over scratches in the stone, marks left by tools or nails. He moved slowly, every step crunching on gravel and broken tile. His light caught on something ahead. A wooden door, rotted but intact, built flush against the earth. He forced it open, and the smell hit him, sweet, cloying, unmistakable. Death. The chamber beyond was small, low-ceilinged, lined with niches carved into the walls. Inside those niches were bones, human bones stacked carefully, almost reverently. Skulls lined in rows, hollow eyes staring into darkness. Hale's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to look closer. Some skulls bore strange markings, symbols carved into the bone itself. Circles intersected with crosses, jagged lines that looked less like decoration and more like ritual. At the center of the chamber was a stone altar, cracked with age. On it lay objects half-rotted by time, fragments of cloth, rosaries, rusted chalices, and among them, something worse. A necklace with a small silver locket, its surface tarnished. Hale opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph, faded but still visible. A young woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling faintly. Margaret Donnelly. Hale staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Had she been here all along? No. The photograph was decades old, the woman much younger. Margaret had once served at this convent, just as she said, and the locket had been left behind, not buried with her. A warning or a reminder. His flashlight caught reflection. The far wall of the chamber bore a plaque, half buried in stone. He brushed the dirt away, revealing engraved words: penance, service, silence. Underneath, in smaller letters, for the pact, we endure. The weight of it crashed into him. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a vault, a shrine. The disappearances weren't scattered accidents across decades. They were collected, ritualized, enshrined as part of a covenant that spanned generations. The air shifted suddenly, a cold draft whispering through the tunnel behind him. Hale froze, listening. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, approaching. He snapped his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing but shadow. He drew his gun, his breath shallow, heart pounding. "Who's there?" His voice echoed, swallowed by the earth. No answer. Only the drip of water from somewhere deep in the tunnel. He backed away from the chamber, eyes darting between the rows of skulls and the darkness beyond. Every bone in that vault seemed to watch him, silent witnesses to whatever still lived in the shadows of Millersfield. By the time he reached the stairs again, his lungs ached with panic. He forced himself up into the freezing night air, the convent looming behind him. In his coat pocket, the locket pressed cold against his palm. A relic, proof that the pact was real, that the dead spoke even without voices. But proof came at a price. Hale knew now the pact wasn't just history. It was alive, watching, and it had followed him into the dark. December the 15th, 1994. Location: Millersfield Town Square. The heart of Millersfield had always been its modest square. An old fountain at the center, ringed by brick storefronts, the post office, and the diner where locals lingered over coffee long after the cups were empty. But as Sergeant Hale stepped out of his car that morning, he sensed something different in the air. Conversations halted as he passed. Eyes followed him from behind windows, behind half-closed blinds. News had spread. Somehow, though he had told no one outside the department, the town knew he had been inside the convent, that he had seen something. Perhaps it was the way Millersfield worked. Whispers passed faster than facts, secrets carried on the wind like wildfire. Inside the diner, silence fell. Hale ordered coffee anyway, ignoring the stares, the faint scrape of shoes on linoleum as people shifted away from him. He noticed Whitmore in the corner booth, pale hands folded neatly on the table. The man didn't bother to hide his smirk. "You've stirred things you don't understand," Whitmore said softly as Hale slid into the booth across from him. "The pact keeps this town standing. It keeps the past where it belongs." Hale leaned forward. "You think I'll be frightened off by bones and carved words? You think hiding bodies in walls makes your history sacred? Whitmore's eyes darkened, his voice low. Sacred or not, it makes it permanent. And permanence has power. Margaret Donnelly knew that. You should have listened when she begged forgiveness. The name struck like a blade. Hale clenched his jaw, keeping his voice steady. Where is she? Whitmore tilted his head, almost pitying. Sometimes people don't vanish. They become part of something larger. Hale shoved himself back from the booth, the chair screeching across the floor. Every eye in the diner locked on him. Men and women he'd known by face, if not by name, now united in silent judgment. Out in the square, the air felt heavier. The Christmas decorations, garlands strung across lamp posts, a tree standing at the fountain, looked absurd against the tension pressing down on him. He walked toward the courthouse but stopped as he noticed 2 patrol cars parked askew, officers leaning against them. His officers. Only they didn't nod, didn't greet him. One of them, Officer Keene, spat into the snow and muttered something Hale didn't catch. The other laughed under his breath. Hale realized then, the town wasn't just turning away, it was turning against. Back at the station, his office had been rifled through, files left open, desk drawers pulled out. The locket he had hidden in a folder was gone. Rage surged hot in his chest, but beneath it was fear. Proof had been stolen, memory erased. He sat in the wreckage of his office, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. A chill spread through him as he understood what was happening. Millersfield wasn't protecting its secret through silence anymore. It was actively pushing back, one voice, one body at a time. That night, as he drove home, a pickup truck followed him down the narrow country roads, its headlights high and blinding. Hale sped up, then slowed, but the truck matched his every move. At the bridge outside town, it suddenly veered close, slamming its bumper against his rear fender. His car swerved, tires screaming on the icy pavement. For a moment, he thought it would send him into the frozen river below. Then, as quickly as it came, the truck pulled back, headlights vanishing into the trees. Hale's hands shook on the wheel as he steadied the car, his breath ragged. He didn't need to see the driver to know what the message was. He was alone. Millersfield belonged to the pact, and it was closing its fist. December 21st, 1994. Location: St. Brigid's Convent, lower tunnels. Snow lashed against the convent walls as Hale forced the door open. The storm outside howled, rattling the timbers, but inside the silence was suffocating. He had waited for this night, chosen it carefully, when the town would be distracted by the winter solstice vigil, a gathering disguised as tradition but, he now knew, rooted in something older, darker. He carried only his flashlight, revolver, and the stolen blueprint from the archives. Margaret Donnelly's name had been circled in faded pencil on one corner, as though even decades ago someone had known she was part of the pattern. The tunnels opened before him like a throat. The walls glistened with condensation, the air thick with earth and mildew. He descended, every step heavier than the last. The storm outside faded, replaced by the slow drip of unseen water and the hollow echo of his own breath. At the first chamber, the bones still lay where he'd seen them before. Skulls grinned in neat rows, eternal witnesses to the covenant carved into the stone. But tonight, something was different. Candles burned along the altar, their flames bending in the draught. And on the altar lay fresh cloth, a chalice filled with dark liquid that gleamed under his light. Someone had prepared this place. Someone was expecting him. A whisper slid through the chamber, barely audible. Penance, service, silence. Hale swung his light, but the shadows only deepened. He gripped his revolver tighter, pulse pounding in his ears. Deeper he went, down a narrow passage where the walls pressed close. The air grew colder, the stones slick beneath his boots. At the end of the corridor, he found a door of blackened oak bound with iron. Symbols had been carved deep into its surface, the same jagged markings etched into the skulls. His hand trembled as he pushed it open. The chamber beyond was vast, carved from the earth like a cathedral. Columns of stone rose to a vaulted ceiling. At the center was a pit, wide and dark, rimmed with crude steps spiraling downward. Figures in black veils stood around it, their faces hidden, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Hale's heart lurched. It wasn't just the pact. It was half the town. He recognized them by posture, by the tilt of a head, even with their faces obscured. Shopkeepers, officers, townsfolk he'd passed in the square every day, all bound in secrecy. At the far side, Whitmore stepped forward, his veil lowered. His expression was calm, almost kind. "You should not have come, Sergeant," he said, his voice carried easily in the cavern. "You've seen more than any outsider should, but there is still time to choose silence, to endure." Hale raised his revolver, his voice raw. "Where is Margaret?" Whitmore's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He gestured to the pit. "She is with us, as all the faithful are. The pact is not death, Sergeant, it is preservation. We bury what must be forgotten, so Millersfield may thrive." The veiled figures began to hum, low and rhythmic. The sound reverberated through the stone, rattling Hale's bones. The pit seemed to breathe, exhaling cold air that stank of rot. Hale stepped closer, gun trembling in his hand. He peered into the pit and staggered back. Bodies. Not bones, but bodies preserved in layers of wax and cloth, their faces pale, their hands folded across their chests. Some decades old, others fresh, their eyes sealed as though in sleep, and among them, her face unmistakable even in death. Margaret Donnelly. Her locket was gone, her expression serene, as if she had chosen her fate. Hale's knees weakened, but rage held him upright. "This is murder," he spat. Whitmore shook his head. "This is legacy. You are the intruder, Hale. The pact has no need of your disbelief." The humming grew louder, the figures closing in, their veils swaying. Hale fired into the air, the gunshot thunderous in the chamber. The sound silenced the chant for only a breath. Then, as if one body, the pact advanced. He backed toward the door, firing again, the muzzle flash cutting through veils and stone. But they did not break, did not run. Their voices rose in a chant that drowned the echo of gunfire, words older than scripture. Hale stumbled through the passage, his flashlight swinging wildly. Behind him, the chanting swelled, footsteps pounding closer. He burst into the first chamber, skidding across the dirt floor, and turned, only to see shadows filling the corridor, dozens of them, faceless and endless. For a moment he thought of running, but instead, he turned the gun toward the altar, toward the relics and bones that had preserved this covenant for generations. He fired again and again, stone shattering, skulls collapsing into dust. The chamber shook. Dust poured from the ceiling, cracks splitting the walls. The pact wailed, their voices breaking into chaos. The ground heaved beneath him, and Hale knew he had only seconds. He sprinted for the stairs, lungs burning as the earth itself seemed to collapse. Behind him, the chamber roared with falling stone, the screams of the pact swallowed by the dark. He burst into the night air as the convent shuddered, the ground beneath it sinking, walls groaning, windows exploding outward. Snow whipped around him as the building collapsed inward, burying centuries of secrets in one deafening crash. Hale fell to his knees in the snow, his chest heaving, revolver empty in his hand. The convent was gone. The pact, if not destroyed, then silenced, buried with their shrine. But as the storm raged on, Hale knew silence was not the same as an ending. Millersfield still watched, and the pact had endured worse. January 3rd, 1995. Location: Millersfield, Massachusetts. The new year dawned gray over Millersfield. Snow lay in heavy drifts along the roads, muffling the town into a silence too deep, too deliberate. Where the convent once stood, there was now only rubble, a wound in the earth quickly claimed by frost and creeping weeds. Reporters came. For weeks they swarmed, their vans cluttering the square, their cameras aimed at the ruins. Hale watched them from a distance, giving careful statements, never revealing what he had truly seen. He told them about structural collapse, about unsafe foundations. He told them nothing of the pit, of Margaret, of the pact. Some believed him, others whispered. The town, as always, remained loyal to its silence. Shopkeepers spoke of Hale in mutters, their smiles brittle. The diner no longer welcomed him. The officers who once served under him resigned in quiet succession. He had survived the pact's wrath, but survival was not victory. At night, in his small rented house on the edge of town, Hale dreamed of the chanting. He saw the veiled figures again and again, their shadows pressed against his windows, their voices crawling into his sleep. And when he woke, he thought he saw movement in the tree line, silhouettes watching from just beyond the snow. He began to write, not for publication but for himself, page after page of what he had found, what he had lost. He wrote Margaret Donnelly's name first, then each name he could recall from the files that had vanished. He wrote of the bones in the walls, the preserved bodies in the pit, the locket that had disappeared from his desk. It was his own record, his only weapon against forgetting. One evening, weeks after the collapse, he found an envelope on his doorstep. No return address, no stamp. Inside was the locket, the one Margaret had worn. Its chain was broken, but inside the locket her photograph remained, her young face smiling with a serenity he could no longer trust. Tucked behind the locket was a slip of paper, folded twice. 3 words were scrawled in an unsteady hand: penance, service, silence. Hale stared at it until the ink blurred, until the words etched themselves into the hollow of his mind. He knew then what he had always feared. The pact had not died with the convent. It lived in the people, in their silence, in their watching eyes. And one day, it would rise again. He closed the locket and set it on his desk. Then, with a steady hand, he turned to a new page in his journal and began to write. Not as an officer, not as a survivor, but as the only witness who still dared to speak. Because if the pact demanded silence, his only rebellion left was the truth.